Now here we have Socrates is going to continue to refute the arguments that Crito is giving him. Now this argument, the third argument Crito gave him was that Socrates is unjust. Why is he unjust? Because he won't leave prison. And so he is hastening the fate that his enemies would hasten. In other words, that Socrates is like joining with his enemies. And his enemies are doing something that's not right. What are they doing that's not right? They put Socrates in prison on these bogus charges. And so Socrates is going to put down some propositions. He is going to put down some premises that he's going to get Crito to agree to. And so Socrates says, one should never do wrong in return, nor do any man harm, no matter what he may have done to you. So then consider very carefully whether we have this view in common, or whether you agree, and let this be the basis of our deliberation. And so Socrates is basically saying one should never do wrong in return. So if somebody harms you, it is not right for you to harm them in return. He's not saying that you can't use self-defense or something like this. But if somebody steals your car, it is not morally right for you to go and steal their car. This is what he's trying to get Crito to agree to here. He's trying to get Crito to agree with these propositions because he's ultimately going to lead to a conclusion. And if Crito has agreed to all these premises, he's going to have, if the argument is valid, he is going to have to agree with the conclusion. And so Socrates is trying to get Crito to see if he agrees with these premises. And if he doesn't agree with one of these premises, then that's going to be the basis for the deliberation. Then that's going to be what they have to argue about. So this first one seems pretty commonsensical, the one that he's given Crito. Should we do harm in return? Should you, if somebody kills your father, should you go kill his father? Would that be right? What does Crito say? No, that wouldn't be right. I agree with you on this, Socrates. I stick to it and agree with you, is what he says. What does he agree with? That you shouldn't do wrong in return. You shouldn't do wrong in return. Don't do eye for an eye. If somebody steals from you, don't steal back from them, right? You have to take it to the authorities. He's not saying that you can't defend yourself or something like this if somebody's attacking you. But he's saying if somebody does harm to you, you should not return the harm, because that is going to escalate and lead to more problems. So he gets Crito to agree with this first proposition, because ultimately, remember, he is going to refute this charge that Crito has made against him, that he's unjust. The next thing, Socrates says, then I state the next point, or rather I ask you, when one has come to an agreement that is just with someone, should one fulfill it or cheat on it? So if you make an agreement with someone, should you fulfill it or cheat on it? So if you make an agreement with your friend, like, hey, pick me up after school, I'll give you gas money, you pick me up. And so you give your friend gas money, and then they don't pick you up. You made an agreement. Maybe you even shook hands. But if it's your friend, you really don't have to do that. But you made a fair, that's pretty fair, some gas money to pick me up later. So school ends, your class is over, you're waiting around for 10 minutes, nobody shows up. And then so you call your friend up, hey, what's going on? I thought you were going to pick me up. And then they say, listen, I never agreed that I was going to fulfill my end of the bargain. I mean, would that be good for you? I mean, would that be reasonable for you? Would you continue to have that person as a friend? Of course not. That would be that'd be horrible reasoning going on here. Why? Because when we make an honest agreement with someone, we expect that it's fulfilled, that people cover their end of the bargain. And so that's why Socrates says this common sense point right here. When one has come to an agreement that is just with someone, should one fulfill it or cheat on it? And what is Crito going to say? One should fulfill it. Of course they should. Kind of hard to get along in life if you don't believe this. Now look at these first two premises that Socrates has laid out. Don't do harm in return when harm's done to you. Okay? Don't do harm back. In other words, no eye for an eye here. Somebody steals from you, don't steal back. And what's the next one? If you make an agreement that's just, you should fulfill it. Okay? These are premises that pretty much anybody would agree to. And that's the type of premises you want to have when you give an argument. You want propositions, you want premises that are strong. Because if the person agrees to the premises and the argument is valid, then they must agree to the conclusion, or else they are being unreasonable. So, next part. Socrates says, do you not by this... Okay, first of all, Socrates, at this point in the dialogue, he is going to go in persona the laws. In other words, he is going to act as if he is the laws. He's the law. And the laws are speaking to him. Okay? So Socrates is acting as if the laws are talking to him, and he is pretending like, hey, I'm planning to escape. What would the laws be saying to me? Here's what the laws would be saying to Socrates. Do you not by this action you are attempting intend to destroy us, the laws, and indeed the whole city? In other words, Socrates, if you escape, do you not by this action you are attempting intend to destroy us, the laws, and the whole city? So, Socrates, by you breaking out of prison and leaving, do you not, what do you think is going to happen? What would happen if people start using you as an example? As in, they start imitating you. What if everybody starts doing what you're doing? They have laws that they don't like and they just disobey them. What if everybody did this? What happens if everybody disobeys the laws of a city? You get right there. That would be happening all over the place. So what you see in that picture right there, be chaos, right? It'd be ruin if nobody was obeying the laws. What if people just decided they're going to stop obeying the traffic laws? Like, I don't like this law. I'm not going to stop at the traffic light anymore. It wouldn't even be safe to drive outside. And so this is what the laws are saying to Socrates. They go on. Did we not first bring you to birth? And was it not through us that your father married your mother and begat you? Tell us, do you find anything to criticize in those of us who are concerned with marriage? In other words, what are the laws you want to break, Socrates? And don't you remember who was responsible for your mom and dad getting together in marriage? Where do you go to get married? Who does it? You go to the justice of the peace, you go to the courthouse. Even if you go to a church, the state, the government, the laws finalize it. And what else do we have here? Do you think that we are on an equal footing, Socrates? In other words, look at what all the things that we do for you. Have you forgot that? And remember, the laws are still talking to Socrates. And they say, do you think that we are on an equal footing as regards the right? And that whatever we do to you, it is right for you to do to us? Are we equal? Concerning whether Socrates is equal to the laws, it continues on. Socrates is not equal to the laws. The laws will continue speaking to Socrates, and they'll say, were you equal to your father? When your father disciplined you, did you discipline him? When your father smacked you, you said something wrong, and he said, get over here, get your face over here, and he smacked you in the face. Did you look up at your father and smack him back? This is what the laws are going to tell Socrates. In other words, the conclusion is, we're not on equal footing. We are not equal. We are in a position of authority over you. So just like you wouldn't reach up and smack your dad in the face when he scolded you when you were a kid, you don't break the laws of the city. Instead, what we have right here, the laws are still talking to Socrates. Instead, Socrates, instead of breaking the laws, this is what you should have done. Here's what's going on. One must obey the commands of one's city and country or persuade it as to the nature of justice. In other words, Socrates, if you didn't like the laws, why didn't you change them? Why didn't you persuade what laws do you have a problem with? And think about it. What is Socrates convicted of? He is convicted of corrupting the youth and atheism. Now, but just think of the corrupting the youth charge. Does Socrates, is that a bogus law, corrupting the youth? Does anybody think it should be all right to corrupt the youth? What about if Socrates escapes prison? Is it all right? Should there be no law against escaping and breaking out of prison? Should that just be a normal thing people do? You would have chaos if you got rid of those laws. So are those the laws that Socrates has a problem with? No, he doesn't have a problem with those at all. He has a problem with the verdict that was reached, not with the laws themselves. And so, again, one must obey the commands of one's city and country or persuade it as to the nature of justice. So Socrates, if you had a problem with the laws, and not just with your bad verdict, if you had a problem with the laws, why didn't you change them? Why didn't you persuade the laws? You didn't. You didn't do any of this. And then they go on. The laws are talking to Socrates. Even so, by giving every Athenian the opportunity, once arrived at voting age, and having observed the affairs of the city, and us the laws, we proclaim that if we do not please him, he could take his possessions and go wherever he pleases. In other words, they're still talking to Socrates here. If you didn't like the laws, why didn't you leave? Why didn't you go? In fact, Socrates never went anywhere. Socrates was in Athens more than everybody else was. He never went anywhere. So this really applies to him. So the laws are saying, Socrates, if you had a problem with the laws, why didn't you persuade them? Why didn't you change them? Why didn't you try to change them? And if you had a problem with the laws, why didn't you leave? Why didn't you go? But instead, you want to break out of prison. You want to break the laws just like that. Now, of course, you have to keep this in mind. The laws are talking to Socrates. So as if Socrates was planning on escaping, following Crito's advice. But of course, Socrates is just testing the argument of Crito. We're still on the argument that Socrates is unjust. So, well, let me just conclude that before I talk about this slide right here. The conclusion is Socrates is not unjust. It would be unjust for Socrates to escape prison. Why? Because of the previous slide I had on, I should have mentioned. He has entered into an implied contract, a social contract with the city. How did he enter this social contract? Just by being there. What the argument that Plato is giving here, that Socrates is giving, it's something natural is what he's saying. He's saying there is something natural that human beings do when they are part of a community. Think about it. When you go to another city, when you go to another state, when you go to another country, do you have to sign on a form every law that you're going to obey? Of course you don't. You may have to sign some other form, but it doesn't have every law that you're going to obey. Well, why don't you have to do that? Because it's implied that you're going to follow the laws of the place that you're at. It is something that we already do. We do it naturally. Okay, so this is where Socrates is coming from here. All right, he's saying that we naturally make an implied agreement, a social contract, to obey the laws of the area in which we are residing. Okay, we naturally, you even do this, not just with countries, you do this with other people's houses. When you go into maybe your in-laws' house or your relative's house, you follow the customs of the house, right? If they got a little rule or a custom where you take off your shoes before you enter, that's what you do. If they have some custom that you eat a certain way, you follow it. You naturally do this. You don't have to sign all the things, customs you're going to follow when you enter in your in-laws' house or one of your relatives' house or one of your friends' houses. Right? You don't do that. And so Socrates is saying that we just naturally, we make this contract with the place that we're residing that we're going to follow the laws. And if we choose not to do that, then we should have persuaded the laws, change them, or we could leave. And so Socrates' conclusion then is that it would be unjust if he left, because he would be doing what? He would be breaking an agreement, a just agreement. You remember that premise? Remember that premise that Crito agreed with? That you should fulfill your agreements and your contracts that you make with people? He agreed to that. Right? And so Socrates showed that he has an agreement with the city. And so he shouldn't break it. And what's the other thing? Remember, Socrates also showed when he was talking through the laws that if he broke the laws, then it's going to cause damage to the city. Remember that picture? The chaos, the damage. If everybody starts breaking the laws, there's going to be damage. There's going to be harm. And just because that was the other premise. That was the other premise that Crito agreed to. If you do harm, if somebody does harm to you, you ought not do harm in return. And so Socrates, by harming the city, in breaking the laws, escaping, he's going to be returning harm for harm done, which Crito agreed he shouldn't do. Okay? And so here's the next argument. And so the conclusion of that one is Socrates not unjust. In fact, it would be unjust if he broke out. And so that's how he refutes that argument. And so this is against argument number 2, that Socrates can go into exile. And so Socrates says, you will arrive as an enemy to their government. All who care for their city will look on you with suspicion as a destroyer of laws. Okay. And so, if Socrates goes into exile, what's he going to do? If he goes to Thessaly into exile, some other land, and he breaks out of prison, how is he going to be treated over there? How are people going to look upon him? Is he going to be able to resume his way of life? What was Socrates' way of life? Socrates was always talking about virtue. Socrates was always talking about doing the right thing, even if it means you're going to have a little pain happening. Right? Do the right thing. You need to be virtuous. The goal of your life is to be virtuous, to follow truth wherever it takes you. Socrates was always talking about this stuff. If he breaks out of prison and he goes live exile in another land, he's going to be a hypocrite. Right? Is he going to be able to resume his way of life and start talking about the good life and leading the good life? Listen, courage is a virtue. Is Socrates going to be able to talk about courage? No, because he will have shown cowardice if he breaks out of prison and go live somewhere else. And so it says here too, you will also strengthen the conviction of the jury that they passed the laws are still talking to Socrates. Okay? So they're still talking to Socrates, and Socrates is in persona the laws. He's making as if the laws are speaking to him. And he says, the laws are saying to Socrates, you will also strengthen the conviction of the jury that they passed the right sentence on you. If he escapes, the conviction will be strengthened. Yeah, they're going to be thinking like, whoa, yeah, we were right. Look at this guy. He doesn't care about the laws. He just broke out of prison. Yeah, so he probably did corrupt the youth and guilty of this atheism. And then they go on. And what will you say? The same as you did here? Virtue is the highest thing? No, of course not. We just went over that. He's not going to be able to say any of that. He was saying virtue is the highest thing, man's most precious possession. So is lawful behavior, right? So he's not going to be, excuse me, he's not going to be able to say any of this stuff. He's going to be a hypocrite if he said that. So this is the fourth argument. That's how he refutes the third argument. The fourth argument was that his children are going to be orphans. All of this is in video, the Crito Part 1 lecture. Okay, here's the laws talking again to Socrates. Will you bring them up and educate them by taking them to Thessaly and making strangers of them, that they may enjoy that too? So the argument that Crito made against Socrates here was that you're going to leave your children orphans. You're going to leave them orphans if you don't, if you choose to subject yourself to the penalty, which is execution. And so the argument here is, if Socrates chooses to escape and to go into exile, how are his children going to be then? What if they stay in Athens, the children? Are they going to have a good life? What are people going to say about them? They're going to make fun of Socrates a little bit, do you think? Other kids can be mean. Look at that picture right there. Everybody's pointing at that little girl. That's how it's going to be for Socrates' children. They're going to be pointing at him. Look at your dad, coward. He was always talking about virtue. And he was convicted and he escaped like a coward. Right? They're going to be saying that to him. Well, what if Socrates takes his kids into exile? Right? And so he has his kids and he's living in exile in another country. Is his kids going to have a good life there? Right? If somebody is escaped from being prosecuted in another country, would you want that person living next to you? What if they were innocent, but you don't speak their language? So you don't really, listen, it's hard to figure out court cases that happen here. It's hard to get to the truth of the matter, let alone another court case from another country. So you wouldn't really know if the person that flees their country, flees prosecution in their country, they come live next to you, you wouldn't really know if they're guilty or not. So what would you assume? You would probably assume, like, this person's guilty. You don't leave for no reason, right? You wouldn't want your kids playing over there. This person could be dangerous. Who knows what they did? They did something so bad they had to flee their own country. You wouldn't want your kids. You wouldn't want a person who fled their country as a fugitive living next to you, right? And what would happen to Socrates' kids if he takes them? He takes them into exile in another country. Just the same thing right here in this picture right here. They're going to be looked down upon. They're not going to have a good life over there. Kids are going to make fun of them. They're going to have a bad light cast upon them. Okay? So this is Socrates' argument against this idea that if Socrates does not escape prison, then his kids are going to be really bad off. In fact, if Socrates has the courage and he subjects himself to the penalty, which is death, then how will the children fare then? What might people start saying about Socrates? What they did start saying about Socrates. Boy, look at the courage that this man had. Because ultimately, people are going to start to realize, like, boy, these weren't the greatest charges that we got this guy with, right? These aren't the greatest charges, but he still stuck by his guns and he took the penalty. And so, if Socrates doesn't escape and he stays and he ends up subjecting himself to the penalty, then people, they're going to start telling these kids, like, boy, your dad was a martyr. Your dad was a martyr for the truth, right? And it's a whole different outlook on their father. And they're going to have a totally different experience. Their father is going to be like a hero, like a martyr, rather than somebody who was a coward and escaped the penalty. And so that's Socrates' argument against argument number 4, that his children they're going to have a bad life. And so I just want to, at the end, make a distinction here between the moral law that Socrates has in mind and a different type of law, a more popular type of law in the present day, one from a modern philosopher, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And so we see from Socrates, the idea of law from Socrates is so real. It's so objective. In other words, outside your mind. That's what objective is. Objective is something that exists outside your mind. The laws are so real that they actually take on voices. Socrates actually becomes the voice of the law. That's how real they are. So you see with this presentation that Socrates gives of the law, you see kind of his philosophy of law. Law is something objective, outside of your mind. Law is objective because they are based on objective moral principles that are real, because the law always comes after the morals. Okay? So there's objective laws based on objective moral principles. This is in contrast to a more modern conception of law. Not to say they didn't have this philosophy back then when Socrates was around, because they did. Okay, but it just takes on a new popular form, and we see that with Rousseau, this French philosopher who said that laws are just the general will. In other words, what the majority of the people will to be a law, that's the law. Okay? So that's not objective at all. That's just the popular opinion. Okay? So, I mean, where's the constraint on that? Because the popular opinion, they can agree on some pretty horrific stuff. Right? So, so if there's popular opinion, the majority of people start willing that anybody who's under 6 feet tall is no longer a human being, right? Then that would be the law. Then how would you counter it, is the point. Okay, because people make bad laws all the time. But the whole point of having an objective law outside of your mind is that you can counter and you have recourse against bad laws. So if there's objective law outside of human beings' mind that's real, that we have to try to conform our lives to, then if somebody makes a bad law, a king or something like this, then we can always hold them to account. But if the law is the general will, as Rousseau says, how do you hold them to account? There is no law. There is no objective law. That's what he's saying. Rousseau is saying there is no objective law. The law is just the general will of the people. So if the general will makes a bad law, how do you counter it? How do you say, hey, that's wrong? You can't. There is no counter to it. And so we see here, not only do we get this presentation of the social contract and all the other arguments Socrates gives in the Crito, but also this idea of these objective laws as opposed to this general will, which is a law that's not objective.